When I think of Houston Cougars quarterbacks, I think of guys like Andre Ware, Kevin Kolb, Case Keenum, and Derek King, but there is one guy who is arguably the best in school history. He may not have won the Heisman or had the best numbers, but he brought the Cougars program to heights they had never seen and delivered hype that had never been there before. He led them to 2 top 10 wins, was one of the top quarterbacks in the country, and was eventually expected to make an impact in the NFL. He was under-recruited out of high school, big programs didn't want to take a chance on him, and even his new coaching staff didn't think he could cut it. Instead, he pretty much proved everyone wrong, became the most notable quarterback in Houston football history, and then went on to make an impact in the NFL at a different position. In today's video, we're going to take a look at the rise of this player, go through his memorable college career, and what eventually happened to him. But right before we get into it, nearly 80% of you guys who watch these videos are not subscribed to the channel, and we are now on the road to 100K, so quickly be sure to hit that subscribe button, smash that like button for the algorithm, turn on post notifications so you never miss when I upload, and let me know what player or topic I could do in my next video. Now, let's get started. So you're probably wondering who the subject of today's video is, and it is none other than former Houston quarterback Greg Ward Jr. He's currently a wide receiver for the Philadelphia Eagles, but going back in time, he was not expected to be a big deal. In order to understand the rise of Greg Ward, we first need to go back in time and see how he became a star to begin with. Like many football stars we know, Greg Ward Jr. grew up in the state of Texas, more specifically the town of Tyler, Texas. His family was a bit different than most, as his dad was actually a minister and preached to a small chapel in the town. Because of that, Greg grew up believing in himself, and he knew he would make it one day, even though many said he would never make it to the highest level. He said, quote, "If that was my mindset, I would have quit a long time ago, but I can't quit. I wasn't raised like that. My parents did not instill that mindset in me. My brothers didn't allow me to do that, and no matter what was going on, no matter what the situation was, I never quit." Football came pretty easily to Greg, as after all, he played with kids who were 8 years older than him. He had 2 brothers by the name of Reggie and Anthony, and both of them were at least 5 years older than him, and they always let him play in their neighborhood games they'd play with all the local kids. Greg apparently started playing with them when he was only 6 years old, and that is supposedly where he got his toughness. His older brother Reggie would actually go on to become a basketball star and played in the junior college levels with a guy by the name of Jimmy Butler, who you're more than likely familiar with. When Ward eventually got to middle school, he would play with his brother Anthony, who at the time was a sophomore running back for the local high school. They'd have many front yard workouts between the two of them, but they became less fun as they became extremely one-sided until the older brother Anthony taught Greg how to properly tackle. From there, his brother actually said that Greg's best skill on the football field was tackling, but Greg himself wanted to play quarterback. Anthony said, quote, "In Pop Warner, he'd be the only little kid who could throw the ball 30 or 40 yards. They tried to go get a quarterback and have them throw it to Greg, but because Greg was such an athlete, that did not work out, so they had to move him back to quarterback and start letting him pass the ball." He was obviously a big-time athlete and a player with a high ceiling, but would he play quarterback or wide receiver when he got to high school? Well, he eventually got to John Tyler High School, where he would start his career as a wide receiver, but the head coach always knew that Ward would eventually become his quarterback. By the time he was a junior, he had become a star, but there was one problem. He was only 5'10", 170 pounds, and that is not exactly what big-time college programs are looking at when it comes to a quarterback. That works for receiver, but not for the signal caller. Eventually, Ward would go on to throw for nearly 8,000 yards in his high school career, but pretty much every school that recruited him wanted him as a wide receiver. Greg didn't like that though, because he said, quote, "I knew what I was capable of, and I knew that God had given me the ability to play quarterback." He had taken that mindset into the recruiting trail, but it would not come without a cost. Oklahoma, Texas, Oklahoma State, and Texas A&M all visited him as they were intrigued by his quickness, his blazing speed, and thought of him as a future star at wide receiver. But the head coach had a different story. He said, quote, "If you guys want to win, you guys are going to recruit him as a quarterback because that is what he is." Only 2 schools ended up offering Ward the chance to play quarterback. One was an HBCU, and the other was Houston. At the time, the Cougars were under head coach Tony Levine, and rather than playing wide receiver in the Big 12, Ward chose to go down a level and play for the Cougars. He eventually chose them over offers from Memphis, Rice, Texas Tech, SMU, and TCU, and had this to say about it. Quote, "It was just the environment there wherever I visited. They've been in the lead since probably the end of my junior season, and everything about the city and the school I liked. I feel like it can be a great place for me to be a student athlete." Ward was your average recruit. According to 24/7 Sports, he was a 3-star player, the number 129 wide receiver, and the 945th best player in the class of 2013. All the big-time programs didn't believe in him as a quarterback, but Greg was ready to prove the world wrong and that he could be a high-level quarterback and produce in the college football world. So obviously Ward arrived in Houston in 2013, and he would play wide receiver for the first year. He caught 10 passes for 95 yards and a touchdown, and as a sophomore, he had caught 15 passes for 139 yards and a touchdown as well. But midway through the year, an injury would happen to the starting quarterback, and this would give Ward his opportunity. He'd end up passing for over 2,000 yards, 12 touchdowns, and 7 interceptions, and he led the team to the Armed Forces Bowl. He had now convinced the Houston staff to let him play quarterback, but after he was gone, a new head coach would come in, and it was Ohio State's new hotshot offensive coordinator, Tom Herman. Would he be able to convince him to play quarterback? That was the big question. Well, the first thing they needed to do was get Ward in shape to play quarterback. Since he was so small, the staff had him eat every 2 to 3 hours, and he was constantly drinking water and protein shakes. He apparently had to take pictures of what he ate and send them to the team's nutritionist, and after all the dedication that Greg went through, Tom knew that Greg was going to be his quarterback. There was apparently one day in practice where Tom knew he was going to be special. At the end of every day, he would select players to do tug of war, and he sent Ward against a bunch of defensive linebackers. He went 8 straight times, and despite not winning, there was no quit in him, and he was constantly up to the challenge. Herman said, quote, "He had nothing left in the tank, but he kept putting his hands back on that rope. Other guys might have flopped down on the ground or said they had hand burns. He got right back on that rope, and that's when I knew he was going to be our quarterback." He obviously knew Ward had the competitiveness required to be his guy, but he was still worried about his size. So how did Greg do in 2015? He helped lead the Cougars to a breakout season where he got his first big win against Louisville, where he threw for nearly 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. The following week against Texas State, he combined for 6 touchdowns, and not only could he throw the ball, but he was a dynamic runner. He ended up finishing the 2015 campaign with 21 touchdowns on the ground and over 1,000 yards rushing. In terms of passing, he threw for nearly 3,000 yards and 17 touchdowns, and he led them to a 13-1 record, including a win over Florida State in the bowl game. Ward had asserted himself as one of the top quarterbacks in the country, and Houston football was the top Group of 5 program. Going into 2016, though, Houston would have 2 extremely difficult games, but if Ward could lead them to wins, this would be the best team in school history. The Cougars began the year ranked, and they were matched up with a top 5 Oklahoma team in Week 1. How did Ward respond? Well, he threw for nearly 350 yards and 2 touchdowns as they upset the Sooners and got the biggest win in school history. From there, they go on to beat Cincinnati and Texas State the following 2 weeks, and then he combined for 5 touchdowns and a win over UConn. The Cougars were 4-0 at this point, but then they dropped a questionable game on the road to Navy. 2 weeks later, they also lost to SMU, but this team was so unbelievably talented that they went on to pull off another big win. This was the year of Lamar Jackson, and the Cardinals were ranked number 3 for this game. What did Houston do? Well, they upset them at home, and they now had 2 top 5 wins. We've never seen a Group of 5 school have 2 wins quite like that, and had they not messed up in those 2 games in the regular season, Houston could have been the first Group of 5 program to have a legitimate shot at the playoff. That is not how it worked out, though. Ward ended up only playing in 12 games, but he still threw for over 3,500 yards and 22 touchdowns, with 500 yards and 10 touchdowns on the ground. His 2015 numbers were better, but he also played in less games in 2016, and teams had another year to scout out and game plan around him. He finished his Houston career with nearly 9,000 yards passing, with 52 touchdowns and 39 more scores on the ground. He became a second-team all-conference player, was a Heisman contender at one point, and led Houston to 2 of their biggest wins ever. From there, as we all know, Tom Herman would take the Texas job, and Houston's gone back to being alright. We have seen them rise in 2021 under third-year head coach Dana Holgorsen, but for the most part, this was the peak of Houston football, and that's why many believe that Ward is the best in school history. Yes, Andre Ware won the Heisman, yes, Kevin Cole put up big numbers, and yes, Case Keenum broke many records, but none of them led Houston to the kind of win that Ward did, and no one brought this much hype to Houston football. You can definitely argue any of those 4, but I will let you guys determine who you think is the best. One thing Tom Herman said right before we left was that Ward's only chance of playing in the NFL was if he moved to receiver, but that an NFL team should take a chance on him. Ward would end up going undrafted during the 2017 NFL Draft, and he would bounce around from the practice squad on the Eagles. The Eagles would end up winning the Super Bowl that year, but Ward was not a part of that. He had pretty much given up on his chances of going to the NFL so he went and played in the AAF for the San Antonio Commanders. After doing well in the 8 games he played in, he went back to the Eagles and signed a 1-year deal. He ended up getting waived during final roster cuts, but then was signed to the practice squad the next day and eventually promoted to the active roster on September 21st. This was really difficult on the family, as they all wanted to see Greg succeed, but he leaned on the values he had learned as a kid to get him through it. His mother said, quote, "He's not the type of person who will open up and say what is on his mind. He'll just hold it in, and I'd ask him, 'Are you alright?' and he would just say, 'Yes, ma'am.' He never complained about anything, but I know it was hurting him because it was killing us." Greg Ward kept fighting and waiting for his opportunity, and it would finally come in 2019. He'd end up playing in 7 games where he caught 28 passes for 254 yards and a touchdown, one of which was a game-winning play. He was brought back for the 2020 campaign, where he would start 10 games for the Eagles and have a career year. He caught a total of 53 passes for 419 yards and 6 touchdowns. Sadly for Ward, he has not had much of an opportunity in 2021, as he has only played in 3 games, catching 2 passes for 30 yards, but what's funny is both of them have gone for touchdowns. Obviously, when you put the ball in his hands, he does a great job, but it doesn't seem like the Eagles see a lot of long-term potential in him, and I wonder if he goes to a different team, if he will make a greater impact. As of right now, it's pretty impressive that Ward has gotten this opportunity and done what he has done in his football career, but I wish it would have gone a little bit better. I remember really loving those Houston teams, and Ward was one of my favorite players back in the day. I didn't know his story going into it, so it was pretty fascinating, and he definitely overcame a lot to get to this point. I really hope he figures it out in the NFL, but in terms of what went wrong for Ward, it's really hard to say anything went wrong, but the one thing that was playing against him the whole time was his genetics. If he was 3 to 4 inches taller, he could have been a franchise quarterback, or at least had a role as a quarterback in the NFL, and his talents could have been on display at a really big program. Other than that, Ward has put in all the work necessary to be a star, and he definitely proved that all those other schools should have taken a chance on him. What do you guys think, though? If you're a Houston fan, is Greg Ward the best quarterback in school history? If you're a fan of another school, let me know a player I should take a look at in my next What Happened To video, and also feel free to let me know any topic I could take a look at in my next video down below. Also, do not forget to smash that like button if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you haven't already, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.